reading out a series of blog posts contemporaneous to the release of David Cronenberg's 2005 film A History of Violence. They are K-punk related. Mostly, they are K-punk's posts, with the exception of one from Jody Dean. Firstly, October 1st, 2005, from K-punk. When we dream, do we dream we're Joey? When you dream, do you dream you're Joey? Carl Fogarty to Tom Stoll in A History of Violence. In a dream, he is a butterfly. When Chuang-Tzu wakes up, he may ask himself whether it is not the butterfly who dreams that he is Chuang-Tzu. Indeed, he is right, and doubly so. First, because it proves he is not mad, he does not regard himself as fully identical with Chuang-Tzu, and secondly, because he doesn't fully understand how right he is. In fact, it is when he was the butterfly that he apprehended one of the roots of his identity, that he was and is, in his essence, that butterfly who paints himself with his own colours. And it is because of this that, in the last resort, he is Chuang-Tzu. Lacan, the split between the eye and the gaze, the four fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis. The key scene in Cronenberg's A History of Violence sees the local sheriff addressing the hero, Tom Stoll, Viggo Mortensen, after a series of violent killings have disrupted the life of the small Midwest town in which they both live. It just doesn't all add up. Superficially, A History of Violence is Cronenberg's most accessible film since 1983's The Dead Zone, yet it is a film whose surface plausibility doesn't quite cohere. All the pieces are there, but when you look closely, they can't be made to fit together. Something sticks out. What makes A History of Violence unsettling to the last is its uneasy relationship to genre. Is it a thriller, a family drama, a bleak comedy, or a trans-generic allegory? The Bush administration's foreign policy based upon a Western? This generic hesitation means that it is a film suffused with the uncanny. Even when the standard motions of the thriller or the family drama are gone through, there is something awry, so that A History of Violence views like a thriller assembled by a psychotic, someone who has learned the conventions of the genre off by heart, but who can't make them work. Perversely but appropriately for a Cronenberg picture, it is this not quite working that makes the film so gripping. The near-total absence of the prosthetics and FX for which Cronenberg is renowned from A History of Violence, traces of his old shtick survive only in the excessive shots of corpses after they have been shot in the face, has been remarked upon by most critics. In fact, Cronenberg's renunciation of such imagery has been a gradual process dating back at least as far as Crash. 1998's existence may turn out to be the last hurrah for Cronenberg's pulsating, eroticized biomachinery, but it has subtilized, rather than removed, his trademark ontological queasiness. Myth is everywhere in A History of Violence, not only in the hokey small-town normality which is threatened, nor in the urban underworld of organized crime that threatens to encroach upon it and destroy it, but also in the conflict between the two. A town like Millbrook, the Indiana setting for A History of Violence, has been as likely to feature in American cinema as an image of menaced innocence in its own right. Comparisons with Lynch are inevitable, but it is Hitchcock, not Lynch, who is the most compelling parallel. The Hitchcock comparison goes far beyond surface details, significant as they are, such as the fact that, as the Guardian review reminds us, A History of Violence's Main Street resembles the one in Phoenix, Arizona, where the real estate office is to be found in Psycho. There is a much deeper affinity between A History of Violence and Hitchcock, which can be readily identified when we recall Zizek's classic analysis of Hitchcock's methodology. In Looking Awry, Zizek compares Hitchcock's phallic montage with the anal montage of conventional cinema. Let us take, for example, a scene depicting the isolated home of a rich family encircled by a gang of robbers threatening to attack it. The scene gains enormously in effectiveness if we contrast the idyllic everyday life within the house with the threatening preparations of the criminals outside. If we show in alternation the happy family at dinner, the boisterousness of the children, father's benevolent reprimands, etc., and the sadistic smile of a robber, another checking his knife or gun, a third grasping the house's balustrade, in what would the passage to the phallic stage consist? In other words, how would Hitchcock shoot the same scene? The first thing to remark is that the content of this scene does not lend itself to Hitchcockian suspense insofar as it rests upon a simple counterpoint of idyllic interior and threatening exterior. We should therefore transpose this flat horizontal doubling of the action onto a vertical level. The menacing horror should be placed outside, next to the idyllic interior, but well within it, under it, as its repressed underside. Let us imagine, for example, the same happy family dinner shown from the point of view of a rich uncle, their invited guest. In the midst of the dinner, the guest, and together with him ourselves, the public, suddenly sees too much, observes what he was not supposed to notice, some incongruous detail arousing in him the suspicion that the hosts plan to poison him in order to inherit his fortune. Such a surplus knowledge has, so to speak, an abyssal effect. The action is in a way redoubled in itself, endlessly reflected as in a double mirror play. Things appear in a totally different light, though they stay the same. What is fascinating about A History of Violence is that it recapitulates this passage from the anal to the phallic within its own narrative development, entirely appropriate for a film that shows, as Graham Fuller puts it, the return of the phallus. It begins precisely with a non-Hitchcockian contrast between a threatening outside, a long sultry tracking shot of two killers leaving a motel, and an idyllic inside, the Stolls family home, where the 6-year-old daughter is comforted by her parents and her brother after she is woken from a nightmare. But as the film develops, it effectively retopologizes itself, interiorizing the threat, or more accurately, showing that the outside has always been inside. The Hitchcockian blot, the thing that doesn't fit, is the hero himself. The film's central enigma is the staid, pacific Tom Stall, really the psychopathic assassin Joey Cusack. Can he be resolved into the question, which Hitchcock film are we watching? Is A History of Violence a rehashing of The Wrong Man or Shadow of a Doubt? Disturbingly, it turns out that it is both at the same time. Shadow of a Doubt is the working out of a family scene, much like the one described by Zizek above, although in that case it is the guest, the rich uncle, who is the threat to the domestic idyll. The uncle, Joseph Cotton, is the killer of rich widows who is holed up in the house of his sister's family to hide from the police. The Wrong Man, meanwhile, sees a family destroyed when the father is falsely accused. In Shadow of a Doubt, the uncle's malevolence means that he must die so that the family idol can be preserved. Only the Teresa Wright character knows the truth. The rest of the family, and the big other of the community, are kept in ignorance. But of the family members in A History of Violence, by the end of the film, only the youngest child could plausibly not be aware that the family scene has always been a simulation. Crucial in this respect is the response of Stoll's wife, Edie, Maria Bello, as Ballard observed in his piece on A History of Violence in The Guardian. A dark pit has opened in the floor of the living room, and she can see the appetite for cruelty and murder that underpins the foundations of her domestic life. Her husband's loving embraces hide brutal reflexes honed by aeons of archaic violence. This is a nightmare replay of the desperate hours, where escaping convicts seize a middle-class family in their sedate suburban home, but with the difference that the family must accept that their previous picture of their docile lives was a complete illusion. Now they know the truth and realize who they really are. But this isn't so much a matter of accepting reality in the raw, as it were, but very much to the contrary, it is a question of accepting that the only livable reality is a simulation. Where at the start of the film, Edie play acts the role of a cheerleader for Tom's sexual delectation, by the end she is play acting for real. And of course, there are no authentic cheerleaders. Real cheerleaders are themselves playing a role. If, as Zizek argued in Welcome to the Desert of the Real, 9/11 was already a recapitulation of the ultimate American paranoid fantasy of an individual living in a small idyllic city, a consumerist paradise, who suddenly starts to suspect that the world he lives in is a fake, a kind of real-life staging of The Matrix, then A History of Violence may be the first post-9/11 film in which the American idol is deliberately and knowingly reconstructed as simulation. This is underscored by the fact that not one frame of the film was shot in America. In this respect, the film resembles Kubrick's Lolita, whose America of motels and dusty highways was entirely reconstructed in Britain. In his interview with Salon.com, Cronenberg pronounced himself proud of his ability to hoodwink American audiences into believing that they were really seeing the Midwest in Philadelphia. When you dream, do you dream you're Joey? The mobster Fogarty, Ed Harris asks Tom Stall, perhaps deliberately echoing Chuang Tzu's story of a man who dreamt he was a butterfly. This is just an aside from myself, from acknowledging our discontent. To my memory, I thought it was William Hurt who asked this question, his character Richie Cusack. In any case, that's kind of irrelevant, frankly. Chuang Tzu famously no longer knows if he is a butterfly dreaming that he was Chuang Tzu, or Chuang Tzu dreaming that he is a butterfly. Is Tom Stall the dream of Joey Cusack, or is Joey Cusack the bad dream of Tom Stall? It's no surprise that Lacan should have fixed upon this story, and Fogarty's question contains an analyst's assumption. The reality of Tom lies not at the level of the everyday empirical, but at the level of desire. The real of Stoll/Cusack is to be found, fittingly, in the desert, the space of subjective destitution, where Stoll says that he killed Joey. In an interesting but ultimately unconvincing piece in Sight and Sound, Graham Fuller argues that we should read the film as Stoll's fantasy. Who is Joey Cusack? The movie ponders at its midpoint as it leaves Western territory behind and plunges into a dark pool of noir. But the more fruitful question is, who is Tom Stoll, if not whom Fogarty claims he is, and why does he have a super-egoic alter ego? The name Stoll indicates stasis. Though he is a diligent, caring husband and father, Tom knows he hasn't made much of himself in life, and we learn harbors resentment towards his estranged dwarfy brother, who considers him a fool. This chip on Tom's shoulder explains his daydreaming, which, born of repression, aligns him with such literary and movie dreamers as Walter Mitty and Billy Lyer, whose fantasies of themselves as all-conquering heroes are redolent of crippling neuroses, even impotence. Tempting as it is, this interpretation is unsatisfactory for a number of reasons. It is guilty of the same one-eric derealization which has blighted responses to both Lynch's Mulholland Drive and Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut, both of which have been interpreted as long dream sequences. Such readings ultimately amount to an attempt to put to rest the film's ontological threat, ironing out all their anomalies by attributing them to an interiorized delirium. The problem is that this denies both the libidinal reality of dreams, we wake ourselves from dreams, Lacan suggests, in order to flee the real of our desires, at the same time as it ignores the way in which ordinary, everyday reality is dependent for its consistency on fantasy. It also makes the empiricist presupposition that the quotidian and the banal have more reality than violence. The message of the film is rather that the two are inextricable. In the end, Stoll as the fantasy of Cusack is much more interesting than Cusack as the fantasy of Stoll. Is the American small-town idol the fantasy of a psychopath? After Guantanamo Bay, after Abu Ghraib, this question has a special piquancy. The challenge that A History of Violence poses to the audience comes from the fact that we fully identify with Stoll/Joey's violence. We gain enormous enjoyment when the hoods are dispatched with maximum efficiency. When we dream, do we dream we're Joey? Do we dream as Joey? Do we dream of being Tom, innocent regular people, no blood on our hands? Are our real everyday lives really only this dream? At the same time as we enjoy Joey's hyper-violent killing of the gangsters, we know that it is impossible for us to position them as the outside and Stoll/Joey as the inside, and the film reinforces the lesson that Zizek thought we should have learned in the aftermath of 9/11. Whenever we encounter such a purely evil outside, we should gather the courage to endorse the Hegelian lesson. In this pure outside, we should recognize the distilled version of our own essence. For the last 5 centuries, the relative prosperity and peace of the civilized West was bought by the export of ruthless violence and destruction into the barbarian outside. The long story from the conquest of America to the slaughter in Congo. The most disturbing aspect about the film's violence is not the gore that results from it, but the reptilian mechanism of its execution. There are no wisecracking one-liners. Instead, once the killings are completed with a coiled spring autonomic power, there is an intranscendable calm, a machine exhaustion. One could argue, this is an aside from AOD, one could argue the Jesus Ritchie remark at the end was one, but that's a digression I'll keep as such for now and not a rebuttal, because I'm captivated with this piece in any case. Once the killings are completed with a coiled spring autonomic power, there is an intranscendable calm, a machine exhaustion. A History of Violence is reflexive without ironic, entirely lacking in any pomo swagger. Postmodern, I believe that ought to be. It is. It may have put the final bullet into Tarantino's, clearly postmodern then. It may have put the final bullet into Tarantino's career if the spectacular indulgence of Kill Bill didn't already do that. A History of Violence suggests that 21C America, 21st century America, is less a country in which violence is a repressed underside than it is Mobian band, where if you begin with ultra-violence, you will eventually end up with homely banality and vice versa. In the final scene, when Tom, returns to his house, everything appears in a totally different light, though it has stayed the same. The images of domesticity have now become images of domesticity. The meatloaf and the mashed potato have become meatloaf and mashed potato, reflexively placed icons of American normality, the very definition of the unhomely, the unheimlich, the uncanny. Such as Zizek said in the 9/11 piece, is the nature of late capitalist consumerist society, where real social life itself somehow acquires the features of a staged fake. This is a simulated scenario far bleaker than that of The Truman Show or Dick's Time Out of Joint, since it has been freely and knowingly embraced by the subjects themselves. There is no them behind the scenes orchestrating and choreographing the simulation. At the end of the film, everyone is fooling, but no one is fooled. And now we'll read from October 18th, 2005, A Seamless Tissue of Fantasies, also from K-Punk. Jodie Dean has an interesting reading of a history of violence that is contrary to mine. She interprets the film as the son's fantasy of violence underlying the passive, ordinary goodness of his father. The son, as Jodie rightly says, was entirely absent from my account of the film. For Jodie, the film is a coming-of-age drama of an aberrant kind in which, only by splitting the father into the good father of the symbolic and the obscene father of the mob of underworld violence, can the son grapple with his own dilemmas of becoming a man. Ingenious as this reading is, I find it unsatisfactory for a number of reasons. First of all, a history of violence frustrates an epistemological interpretation of this type at every turn. It is not a film like Fight Club, Memento, and The Machinist, i.e. an enigma which resolves into questions of epistemological motivation. In those films, once you realize that what we have seen is the product of a psychiatrically and or neurologically disordered mind, everything falls into place. They are jigsaw puzzles which can be put together, and sense can be restored. A History of Violence, by contrast, is closer to Mulholland Drive and Eyes Wide Shut, films which scramble sense and leave it scrambled. Appearances to the contrary, there is no moment of ultimate revelation in A History of Violence. The revelation at the level of diegesis, our discovery that Tom is Joey, does nothing to resolve the film's most troubling quandary, which is ontological rather than epistemological. At the end, nothing makes sense, because the questions the film has raised, not only what here is real, but more profoundly, what is the real, have not been settled. Part of the problem with Jodie's reading is that there is no clear ontological hierarchy in A History of Violence. Nothing is marked as more real than anything else. This, again, is by contrast to Fight Club or The Machinist, which turn upon a discrepancy, concealed in the early parts of the films but exposed by their end, between the psychotic delirium of the lead characters and a publicly validated empirical reality. But there is no such discrepancy in A History of Violence, largely because there is no uncontested, convincing empirical reality from which we can clearly differentiate the phantasmatic elements. There is only a seamless tissue of fantasies. This is what makes a superficially conventional A History of Violence more ontologically unsettling than something like Existence. Existence presents an embedded ontological hierarchy in which different realities are contained within each other, the most real being the one that embeds the rest. By the end of Existence, this hierarchy has been disrupted first by the reality bleed between ontological levels, so that supposedly inferior realities come to contaminate superior higher level realities, and second by the suggestion of an infinite regress of realities with no ground level. A History of Violence gets to this sense of groundlessness or abgrund without recourse to a vertical mode of nested realities. Realities not placed one inside the other, but juxtaposed one next to the other. A different kind of reality bleed altogether. As Jodie rightly observes, when we first see the son, he is part of a completely fantastic image of the perfect family, a teenage son concerned about his little sister's bad dream. This then would appear not to be real, but what is? There is barely one situation in which the son finds himself that is not equally implausible. His verbal and then physical besting of the bully, like his shooting of the gangster to save his father's life, seem obviously phantasmatic, but then so does everything else in the film. Jodie might argue that the film's real is not what is depicted at the level of its diegesis, yet her reading of necessity relies on privileging certain elements of what we do see. Most obviously, we have to accept that the son really is a son, really is at high school, etc., etc. Jodie's reading also surreptitiously resolves the film's ontological tension by assuming that the Joey reality is ontologically inferior to the Tom reality. On what grounds, though? As Jodie herself notes, the stalled domestic paradiso is no more realistic than the organised crime inferno. It is just that, in the first case, the fantasies derive from melodrama, while in the second, they are taken from the gangster genre. In this respect, A History of Violence can be compared with The Shining, which similarly mediates between the conventions of family drama and those of another genre, in that case horror. See Walter Metz's intertextual analysis here. Paradoxically, the Stoll family only seems realistic once it is menaced by mobsters who are no more realistic. If there is realism at all, it is generated by the tensions between the conventions of two genres. Jodie says that my reading was too quick to remove fantasy, but I would want to argue that Jodie, like Graham Fuller in Sight and Sound, contains fantasy by giving it a diegetic motivation. What this leaves out is, in a way, the most obvious phantasmatic level, that of our own fantasies. It is not that the events of the film can be reduced to the fantasy of one of the characters. No, the film forces us to confront the way in which the characters are our fantasies. The violence is the violence of our wish fulfillments. Which is why I wholeheartedly concur with Jonathan Rosenbaum, Fire. There's hardly a shot, setting, character, line of dialogue, or piece of action in A History of Violence that can't be seen as some sort of cliché, he writes. Its fantasies about how American small towns are paradise and big cities are hell are genre standbys that Cronenberg milks at every turn. But none of this plays like cliché. Cronenberg is such an uncommon master of tone that we're in a state of denial about our familiarity with the material, a kind of willed innocence that resembles Tom Stall's own disavowals. Now I'll read out Jodie Dean's response. This was published October 19th, 2005. Response to K-Punk, We Are Figures in Our Fantasies. K-Punk's rejection of my reading of A History of Violence rests on one claim, that I surreptitiously resolved the film's ontological tension by assuming that the Jory reality is ontologically inferior to the Tom reality. Yet, as he quickly concedes, I in fact do not do this. As Jodie herself notes, the stalled domestic paradiso is no more realistic than the organised crime inferno. Nothing in my reading of the film suggests this ontological prioritization. Rather, as I emphasize throughout my discussion, the film is a set of interlocking fantasies, and I read these fantasies as primarily those of the son. The possible angle of the wife's fantasies are clearly subordinate in that we don't get any sense of what sort of dilemmas she may be encountering. Thus, the fantastic quality of the long-term, sexually hot, loving relationship with a perfect man who is ultimately a stranger seems, in a way, stifling, already resolved. So in whose world would marriage be so resolved? The fantasy world of the son. The son grapples with what it is to become a man. He confronts on one side fantasies of the perfect family which provide unbearable, suffocating, impossible answers to the question of what it is to be a man. He confronts the obscene flip side of these fantasies in violence. Each side is as fantastic as the other, as I make clear in my reading of the film. Whatever symbolic resolution appears in the final scene is, of course, held together by fantasies. With not much else to go on, K-Punk resorts to a conventional flip/reflexivization. The fantasies are our fantasies. Okay, what isn't? That's what makes this sort of move so uninteresting and ultimately impossible. Once that turn occurs, every fantastic content appears at the same level. One doesn't need to talk about the film at all. The flip dissolves precisely the content it presumes to discuss. K-Punk rightly recognizes that nothing is more ontologically real in A History of Violence than anything else, and he resists my reading because he falsely claims that I rely on an ontological given that can't be defended in terms of the film. But what if one recognizes that we are figures in our own fantasies? At this point, it is easy to understand the film is the son's fantastic working through of the challenges of masculinity as it is split between the weak, passive father and obscene superego violence. The film doesn't reassure us of some reality outside precisely because it depicts/relates/forms the fantastic subjectivity of the son. The reassurance of an external gaze is excluded precisely because it would rely on a master signifier, the very possibility of which the film challenges. Now finally, the K-Punk response to this. October 20th, 2005. Anomalous superficiality. Hey, old school style interblog business. Jodie answers my objections to her reading of A History of Violence, and now Steven Shavira weighs in with what may turn out to be the definitive account. Jodie complains that I have failed to take account of her acknowledgement that the gangster elements of the film are no less real than the family scenes. On the contrary, I think that it is her reading which contradicts that acknowledgement, and must do. I accept that explicitly she concedes that the family reality has no ontological priority over the gangster, but the point is that her interpretation of the film depends on a clear implication inconsistent with that awareness. To say that the film is the son, Jack's fantasy, is surely to say that the entire gangster plot is the product of his psychological conflicts. How could this not be treating Jack, and by extension the family/melodrama generic elements, as more basic, i.e. more real, than the gangster generic elements? On this model, Jack's psychology is a stabilizing epistemological baseline to which everything in the film can be indexed, yet there seems to me to be no warrant in the film for such a privileging. On the contrary, what is remarkable about A History of Violence is its refusal of the possibility of this kind of hierarchical settling. Jack's psychological conflicts and struggles of manhood are every bit as cliched as the hyperbolic violence of the Joey plot. To treat the melodrama conventions as generative of the gangster conventions is not only arbitrary, it misses what is most troubling and most distinctive about the film's ontological disturbances, which amount to a kind of Escherizing of the genre. That is, E.C. Escher, the artist, the visual artist, lithographs. They're fantastic. You know, the Endless Stairway. In A History of Violence, The History of Violence is characterized by what we might call an anomalous superficiality. The film is pure surface, or rather pure surfaces, limbed together in such a way that we are aware of a structural inconsistency but are unable to see the joins. The seamlessness of which I wrote in my last post is the seamlessness of the Mobian band, about which Stephen writes so well. At any given point, it seems to have two sides, but the two sides are really the same side. Each is continuous with the other, and slides imperceptibly into the other. There is no way to separate the Capra/Spielberg side from the noir/revenge nocturnal side. The common interpretive tendency in cases like this is to see the dark side as the deep, hidden underside of the bright side, the depths beneath the seemingly cheerful surface, but in A History of Violence, everything is what it seems. Both sides, both identities, are surfaces, both are superficial, and they blend into one another almost without our noticing. The small town, with its overly ostentatious friendliness, is a vision of the good life, but Brother Richie's enormous mansion, furnished with a nouveau riche vulgarity that almost recalls Donald Trump's penthouse, is also a vision of the good life. An important point here being that Trump's own penthouse in real life is itself, of course, a fantasy, but so is small-town family life. It too is a matter of actors occupying a stage set. America, as Baudrillard, following Dick and Ballard, long ago realized, is itself, in its actual reality, an assemblage of incommensurable reality options, given an illusory but performatively effective consistency only by fantasy. Yet fantasy precisely has no origin in interiority. On the contrary, all seeming interiority is the playing out of fantasies that are intrinsically social. Furthermore, it is not only that, as Stephen rightly insists, cinematic fantasies are social, it is also that social fantasies are now deeply cinematic. Hence, to see the film as the playing out of our fantasies is at the same time to see ourselves as the playing out of fantasies which belong to no one, which cannot be routed in any inside. Jody is right that this is to void any interpretation confined to the film's content. Again, though, this is the point, for psychological interpretations not only privilege a particular psychology within the diegesis, they also privilege the epistemological over the ontological. A History of Violence, however, is a film which goes out of its way to expose the way in which genre is ontology, and demands that we pose to ourselves the question of our libidinal complicity in the realities cinema constructs. It is a film which invites us to confront the radical inconsistency of our phantasmatic constructions and of our libidinal investments. Our desire for the family idol is what produces our cheering for Jack and Tom's recourse to ultra-violence when that idol is threatened, and this complicity is the glue which joins the two sides of the Mobian band, the Capra/Spielberg and the noir/revenge worlds, together in a seamless loop. A film reduced to Jack's psychological conflicts could safely be externalized, but if we ourselves are Tom Joey, animals of a taste for violence hiding in a simulation of domesticity, then the film has forced us to confront the flimsiness of the film sets we inhabit. A History of Violence would then belong to a kind of meta-generic ontological uncanny which performs that destruction of the homely that the situationists were so fond of invoking. The show is over. The audience get up to leave their seats. Time to collect their coats and go home. They turn around. No more coats and no more home. Vasily Vasilyevich Rozanov, The Apocalypse of Our Time.